Knitting is the process of using two or more needles to loop yarn into a series of interconnected loops in order to create a finished garment or some other type of fabric. The word knitting, or to knit, is derived from the word knot. Its origins lie in the basic human need for clothing or protection against the elements. More recently, hand knitting is becoming less a necessary skill and more a hobby. The oldest knitted artifacts are socks from Egypt, dating from the 11th century CE. The complexities in these artifacts, however, suggest that knitting is even older than the archaeological record can prove. Most histories of knitting place its origins somewhere in the Middle East, and from there it spread to Europe by Mediterranean trade routes and later to the Americas with European colonialization. The earliest known knitted items in Europe were made by Muslim knitters employed by Spanish Christian royal families. Several paintings from Europe portray the Virgin Mary knitting and date from the 14th century. Archaeological finds from medieval cities all over Europe, such as London and Amsterdam, show that knitted goods were used for everyday use from the 14th century onward. Knitting was such an important occupation among those living in the Scottish Isles during the 17th and 18th centuries that whole families were involved in making sweaters, accessories, socks, and stockings. Fair Isle techniques were used to create elaborate, colorful patterns. Sweaters were essential garments for the fishermen of these islands because the natural oils within the wool provided some element of protection against the harsh weather encountered out while fishing. The 1920s saw a vast increase in the popularity of knitwear in much of the Western world. Fair Isle knitting enjoyed a golden age during the 1920s, reputably started by the Prince of Wales' future Edward VIII, wearing a Fair Isle pullover sweater to play golf. Both Fair Isle and Argyle styles have since been associated with the sport. High fashion also embraced knitwear, with Coco Chanel making prominent use of it and Vogue magazine featuring patterns. Before the 1920s, the majority of commercial knitting in the Western world had centered around production of underwear, socks, and hosiery. This vastly expanded as the public taste for knitted fashion did also. Both hand and machine knitting were commercially attractive on a large scale prior to the Great Depression. The 1920s saw a continuation in the growth of interest in home/hobby knitting, which grew during the First World War. Conditions of trench warfare led to a shortage of socks in particular, and the Allied home front was encouraged to support the troops by knitting. The hardship experienced by many during the Great Depression meant some turned to knitting through necessity. It was much cheaper to knit your own garments than to buy hand or even machine knitted products. Skills were needed for repairs to existing garments, socks, and underwear. The increased availability and low cost of machine knitted items meant that consumers could have a sweater at the same cost of purchasing the wool and pattern themselves, or often for far less. So knitting became to rapidly decline after World War II. The 21st century had seen a resurgence of knitting. This growth can be noted in part to coincide with the growth of the internet and internet-based technologies, as well as the general homemade revolution and interest in DIY crafts. Celebrities including Julia Roberts, Winona Ryder, Dakota Fanning, and Cameron Diaz have been seen knitting and have helped to popularize the revival of the craft. The new millennium also has seen a return by men to the art of knitting. In addition, a type of graffiti called yarn bombing has spread worldwide. Like traditional graffiti, this consists of creating knit pieces in public spaces without permission, such as placing sweaters on public statues.